All right, I will, ooh, it's very loud, isn't it? I moderated a panel this morning in a room with about 120 people, and it was so loud from the other, you could hear everything outside and in the next room that we had to shout. Now we're in a room with not so many people, and it's very low cities generally yet around the world. There are some places where you have internet studies or internet and society type programs, but internet governance itself, I think, enjoys much less status in the institutional context of universities, as well as think tanks, research institutes, and so on. The people who are doing interesting work in the field are kind of sprinkled around a lot of different institutions in a lot of different disciplines, and struggling somewhat to find a common vocabulary, a common set of issues that define their agenda, and a way to sort of build the field's coherence in the sense of developing a progressive research program that would lead to its clarification and articulation. So we are really, even after 10 years of discussion around this, I think still at a very early stage in the development of scholarship around internet governance. That we have some new journals that have been created and things like that, but we're in an early stage. And so it's good to use the IGF to take stock of where we are, what we think some of the most important pressing issues are, and how scholars can proceed going forward and engage in more productive dialogue with non-scholars as well. So that's sort of the background thinking to this session, and with that said, I'm going to turn to my panelists and ask them to provide 7 minutes or so of opening remarks about what they think some of the more interesting current challenges are, and then we'll have a little interaction.
Yeah. Okay, great. And it was a very, very thoughtful set of presentations and intriguing papers. I encourage you to check it out. And at least the first couple of presentations took a closer look at notions of internet governance from this academic perspective. And listening to these presentations, it's kind of a moment where you're not sure whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person, right? Because the glass half full person in me said, wow, that's amazing, all the work that is happening here, the good work underway, the insight that the researchers presented, of course, as placeholders for academia at large. And there's a lot to work with in terms of what we know about governance and from other fields, what we can learn from other fields and incorporate into internet governance discussions. There are all sorts of disciplines we can borrow from, from law and political science to behavioral economics, you name it. So we have lots of tools to work with when we think of methods even and methodologies we can deploy to make sense of what's happening in this world. But then there is also the glass half empty person in me leaving the room with some sort of a sobering feeling that suggests, well, there are still a lot of open questions about very fundamental, even definitions, terms, what concepts mean. Internet governance was kind of the focal point of the morning, but of course we could ask same questions. What do we mean by transparency? What do we mean by accountability? What do we mean by participation? And the likelihood, as we all know, coming out of multi-stakeholder discussions today and continue them tomorrow, it's very likely that we mean different things by these terms. So you could say, well, that's typically academic, right? There is this person talking about definitions, but I think that would be a misunderstanding. More recently, however, we thought, okay, given the uncertainty that we have, given the current landscape of internet governance and the many research questions as they present themselves to us as academics, could we engage in a coordinated research effort that brings together people from around the globe, research centers from around the world. We have over 10 centers from the Global South alone, to make progress or at least contribute to the clarification of some of these key terms and key concepts by specifically reflecting on local experiences that we have around the world on internet governance issues, but also other forms of governance. So what we are working on right now, starting in a kind of a very modest way, is we picked one particularly popular concept out of the Net Mundial roadmap and the ILFES panel, which is this notion of distributed governance and distributed internet governance models, groups, and mechanisms, and asked ourselves, okay, what does that mean, or more specifically, what could that mean in the future? How do we build distributed governance systems? How do we operate them? How do we evaluate them? So there are a number of guiding questions. And we teamed up with a number of centers out of this network and are currently working on a set of about 12 case studies, again, from different countries and different contexts, where we have seen examples or experiments with that sort of distributed internet governance making. To give an example, the Turkish Internet Improvement Board, and Leila is a member of that board, is an example, or CGIBR, that received, of course, a lot of attention already in Brazil, something Marilia is very familiar with, is another example, or the Enquete Commission in Germany, of which Jeanette was a member, are kind of the types of case studies we're currently looking into. And we will present drafts on October 1st and 2nd in Turin of these case studies, and hope to also connect this first set of case studies, distill lessons learned from each with respect to this question of what does it mean to establish and operate distributed governance systems by the end of the year. So we hope to come up with a synthesis paper. If I just have one more minute, that exercise, and this goes back to how I started, that exercise is, in our view, just kind of a proof of concept. It's a pilot. It's a research pilot to demonstrate what an academic global network, building up on the great work of people like Bill Drake and Milton Muller and many others, what we can contribute almost real time as a discussion is going on, a global discussion and a quest for new governance models. Bless you. And the hope is very much that based on that pilot, we can also think about a future research agenda that is perhaps more ambitious in scope, that moves from high-level conceptual questions to implementation issues, to design issues, and then of course ultimately also move from research to education and facilitation and experimentation and tool building, all activities that are also academic or where academia can play an important role. So these are a few opening thoughts provoked by this wonderful GigaNet symposium that Bill contributed to and Milton Muller hosted. So thank you.
Very much, yours. That was very interesting. Sorry, should I adjust this to 8 minutes instead of 7? We said 7. Is 7 okay, Marilia? Okay, Marilia talks very fast. Actually, don't talk too fast because of the translators. Okay, and the remote participants, if any, and the taping and so on. Thank you. Marilia?
Thank you very much, Bill, and you're right, I do speak fast, I'll slow down. I was here this morning in another session, and when our moderator introduced the session, the first thing she said was, okay, talk about anything you want, but don't come with Net Mundial or the NTIA IANA functions transition, because we heard enough of that. And I said, don't worry, I will start with Net Mundial, but I'm not going to focus on that, so I'll tell you the same now. I'm not going to talk about Net Mundial itself, although I was very involved in the organization of Net Mundial. I was part of the executive committee that organized the meeting and had the work to develop the first draft that was put under public consultation, so it was a very interesting experience. But what I wanted, I start with Net Mundial just to highlight 2 points. The first of them is some areas of research that I think Net Mundial opened, or at least made more important for the academic community. I think that there are some gaps that research are required. And my second point would be to give an example of that, 2 case studies that we are developing at the Center for Technology and Society, how we are conducting this research. So I think that Net Mundial, in terms of substance, it had very important points that could be used as a starting point for the development of research. But I work with Internet governance more on the perspective of researching the global architecture for Internet governance. What are the institutions? What are the actors? How they organize? So from the perspective of the architectural organization of Internet governance, I think that Net Mundial, 3 pieces of the document, they kind of pave the way for a more constant evolution of the ecosystem. The first of them is when the document talks about the Internet governance framework. And I know that we all remember for how many years we have been discussing about the polarity of polarization between centralized models that maybe would be localized under the United Nations and distributed models. And of course we know that the controversy is far from being over. We have WSIS +10 coming up next year. But I think that the document that was approved by the end of Net Mundial, it clearly makes an option for distributed models. And it's very interesting being part of the executive committee to read through all the contributions that were presented to Net Mundial and see how there is a massive support for distributed models for Internet governance. And this made it to the outcome document, which has multi-stakeholder support. So I see this as a step forward in this debate. We have a document to anchor this position now. The second point that I think the document talks about that could give food for thought for more research is the roles of the stakeholder groups. For many years as well, we have been discussing, based on the definitions that were laid out, what are then these policies that require the participation of stakeholders in different ways. For instance, this is something that has started to be explored. There was a very interesting paper presented in GigaNet last year by Laura Denardes and Mark Raymond that they discuss multi-stakeholderism and the role of different actors, but more work certainly needs to be done on that aspect. And the third area, I think it's related to knowledge, to the production of information and knowledge when we're talking about Internet governance. One of the difficulties that we have, and that supports the idea that a more centralized model would be something welcome, is that it's very hard to read the ecosystem and to understand what is going on and to understand where you should go when you want to discuss a specific issue, or to have a clear picture of the different fora in which one issue, such as privacy, is being discussed now. And I think that the document lays the ground for creating a clearinghouse that would be a focal point for dissemination of information. Bill has written a chapter in a book he just published together with a Moral Price about the topic of the clearinghouse. Maybe something he can explore with us a little bit further. But I think it's a very important thing in the document, and it's good that he made it into the document. I think that as Net Mundial was a very important event, and we can see that by the fact that it is already, creating consequences into the future. And two of these consequences is the first one that talks about IGF improvement have become more concrete. For 2 years now, we have the report of the working group on IGF improvements, but that discussion has not really moved forward. And I think that after Net Mundial, we have the political push to implement some of the changes that would make the IGF more effective and outcome-oriented and more strong, even in terms of resources. This is an important point. And the second development after Net Mundial is, of course, the Net Mundial initiative. And it's good initiative if it follows the principles that have been laid out by Net Mundial in terms of bottom-up participation, transparency, and inclusion. But the initiative draws from a document that I think maybe we should pay more attention to, which is the report of the high-level panel that has been coordinated or facilitated by ICON. They produced the EVIS report. I think that there are some interesting ideas in that report. It is the first time that I'm aware that it clearly kind of lays out a roadmap for us to make decisions in distributed networks. There were some proposals that have been advanced mostly by civil society / academic people before. And I think that this document kind of goes in a similar direction, but it's more organized in terms of methodology and steps to make decisions in distributed networks, going from issue identification to solution mapping, solution formulation, and solution implementation. Probably this is something we could be looking into the future. One thing that I believe it's missing from this report is one concern that many actors have, not only developing countries, but civil society and other less resource actors, which is how distributed internet governance networks will bridge the gap that we face right now in terms of, if you think about policy development, the ideal space or the traditional space for policy development is the national level. On the national level, we have instruments of democratic control and accountability, which allow us to understand, of course, the system is failed and has problems, but to understand is if a policy or a regulation has been developed or not following democratic standards. And we don't have the same on the global level. We don't have the same on the distributed networks. So I think one lesson from Net Mundial is that the process is really important. If we want to create distributed networks, it's not enough to say, as the report does, that, okay, let's create networks around specific issues and interested people will coalesce. Because the people that are going to coalesce around those issues are people that are already participating. We should not forget that globalization, one of the effects is that some people have become indeed more globalized, but others have become more localized, territorialized. And if we don't want the distributed governance networks to be populated by people who are already participating, then we need to have process. We need to have structure. So it's not only methodology, but we have to couple the discussion of internet governance, and I think that this is another strong point of Net Mundial outcome document. It talks about multi-stakeholder participation side by side with democracy. We have to think about how could democratic standards, which is not our traditional democracy that we have on the local level, but how democratic standards of accountability, transparency, and participation could be developed in these networks. Otherwise, we will be just alienating part of the people that should be included in these discussions. That would be my first remarks. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's turn now to Leila for a Turkish view.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I would like to thank you also for, sorry. I think you should hold. Okay. Thank you very much for being here with us. I would like to thank you also for the IGF and also Turkish government in order to accept this open forum as a part of IGF Istanbul. I would like to share with you, as an academic institution in Istanbul, in Turkey, our approach and point of view in terms of distributed internet governance or multi-stakeholder internet governance model or the topic itself. According to me, there is an internet governance ecosystem. I call this ecosystem as a puzzle. This puzzle consists of different components. There are lots of important pieces of that puzzle. One of them is academia. And as a part of this puzzle, I describe academia as incubation of ideas. Just because we academic people has an important duty, that is, we have to teach young people. And these young people, which we called Y generation, is more than familiar than all of us, can I say, all of us, more than familiar to the technology, internet, and kind of IT related issues. During our courses, it is important to get their opinions and views when we discuss with them internet governance or multi-stakeholder internet governance issues. It's really important for me to know what the next generation think about the current problems or current debate on internet governance issues. On the other side, as an academic institution, we are a nexus of all other stakeholders. As an independent platform, we can combine together all related stakeholders in order to discuss and create or shape ideas in order to determine the problems or topics to discuss or problems to resolve. It is another important aspect of academia, particularly in Turkey. On the other side, we have a kind of direction capability based on our academic experience, based on our academic papers or academic events, etc. It has also significant importance to affect the people, to affect other stakeholders, based on the facts and findings of our academic papers or academic research activities. And the next step is important to me with international global academic collaborations and also institutional collaborations is also important for us just because it enables to use our time and effort more efficiently. For example, Marilia mentioned lots of several important reports and also the works on distributed internet governance. There are lots of resources around us in terms of international works, etc., which show us the way which we follow. And it has also importance when we start to create, when we start to think about our local distributed internet governance model. So that's my initial points.
Great. Thank you very much, Leila. And now we turn to our final perspective. And by the way, Leila, you beat the clock. You've got 2 minutes. You've got two minutes left. Would you like to add anything? Or?
Use later.
Okay, you use later. You're a model of efficiency. Jeanette, will you meet the same standard? No.
Oh, I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Expectations too high. I'm going to talk about a somewhat unique model. It's called in German Enquete Commission, and the perhaps best English equivalent would be a Parliamentary Inquiry Commission. But what is special about this specific type of Parliamentary Inquiry Commission is that it's composed to 50% of members of the Parliament, and the other 50% are external experts, such as academics like me, but also professionals. So what enquete commissions basically do is they try to create an interface between democratically legitimized decision makers and experts. So it's the idea to bring together those who make decisions on our behalf and researchers and professionals who have the expertise necessary to make those decisions. There's, as far as I know, only one other country that actually has these kind of inquiry commissions, and that is Austria. The tradition goes back to the 1960s, and they are sort of part of the parliamentary process. They are constituted by rules and regulations of the parliament. The way it works is that the parliament says, yes, here's a complex long-term issue, and we need to know more about this issue before we as a parliament feel equipped enough intellectually to make laws or other forms of decisions on it. They have a fairly extensive mandate, so enquete commissions work for 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. The one that I wrote my case study for Ur's project about was an enquete commission called Internet and Digital Society, and it ran from 2010 until 2013. It had all in all 34 members, half of them, as I said, members of the parliament, and the other half consisted of lawyers, political scientists, businessmen, but also a few civil society representatives, members of unions, etc. The mandate we had was given by the parliament, and it covered a diverse range of subjects such as copyright, net neutrality, data protection, green IT, education, security, and on and on and on. Sort of all in all, about roughly 15 different subjects. And the way we worked is that we formed working groups consisting of all the groups present in the enquete commission on each of these issues. The outcome of these working groups and of enquete commissions in more general are reports. And these reports, again, always consist of two parts. One part is sort of the state of things, so where all members do research, collect information on the given subject. And the second part is a set of recommendations. And now what worked really well in this enquete commission is collect information about the state of things. Because what we early on agreed upon is that we would collect also diverse perspectives and diverse resources. So what we would typically do is on really contested issues such as net neutrality is that we would say there is a big political controversy on this subject, and Group A thinks ABC and Group B thinks EFG, and it's for third parties to decide what side is the correct one or what perspective the parliament wants to pursue. So this worked quite well. We would try in a neutral way describe the controversy, what it was about, and present again in a neutral way the various perspectives, opinions that we could find and could sort of give evidence for. But what is very difficult for these commissions is to actually come up with political recommendations. It's particularly difficult when a subject such as net neutrality is very close to sort of everyday kind of politics and legislation. The issues that were rather remote from legislation, we could more easily agree upon. But everything that is really close to legislatory processes would then be dominated by the various political parties being represented in the parliament. So here we would then have, as a enquete commission, majority votes on the recommendations. But at the same time, we would have minority positions represented in the reports. When they were short, they would be on the same page. If they were long, they would be in an annex of the report, and thus not as easily to find as the majority vote positions. So why is that relevant in the context of distributed governance structures? The message that I got out of our work when I started writing this case study is that collecting information and presenting it to those who are in a position to make decisions is a way of enhancing the legitimacy of decision-making processes that are not part of parliamentary national processes. What we typically find for issues like internet governance is that they are transnational, and therefore it's very difficult to come up with legitimate ways of decision-making. Basically, what we heard already earlier, what Maria, for example, reported about, the difficult issue is to come up with legitimate structures and sort of collecting knowledge in a way that we know what the options are and what possible implications are can be a way of substituting the lack of democratically constituted decision-making structures and sort of try to replace that or complement that by knowledge, presenting knowledge in a way that we know what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very efficiently concluded. Okay, so I hear several sort of like broad themes emerging inductively from this conversation. One is that academics can play an important role in contributing to the clarification of key concepts that are being bandied about often in the internet governance dialogues and actual governance processes as being the base for moving forward with new institutional developments, initiatives, and so on and so forth, and that very often the lack of clarity, specifically on what some of these terms may mean, can be problematic in terms of the possible trajectories that are followed going forward. More generally, I heard, I think, building off of that, a concern with the ways in which scholars can contribute to these larger discussions. What the interface is, as Leila says, as a piece of the puzzle in the ecosystem. If one thinks about the internet governance ecosystem, and it's a term that I think is somewhat problematic. We've all come to use it lately, but it's been sort of institutionalized in our collective discourse in the past couple of years. I think it's worth problematizing itself, quite frankly. But let's take it for a second as a concept. If you think about how that is composed, we have both an array of you could say vertically organized governance spaces that deal with particular issue sets in particular institutions. So you've got you've got the bodies that deal with names and numbers, ICANN, there are RARs, so on. You've got the bodies that deal with technical standards, IETF, World Wide Web, etc. You've got the bodies that deal with security, the bodies that deal with intellectual property, which tend to be more intergovernmental, the bodies that deal with digital trade, e-commerce, privacy, on and on and on. Then you have cross-cutting horizontal types of social formations. In the panel that Morelia referred to, the high-level panel, I was an advisor to that process and involved in discussions. We talked about those as enablers, and we talked about the role of expert communities and professional communities such as academia, but also more bounded, focused expert communities like the Internet Society or others like that, right? We talked about, or communities of practice. We talked about capacity building programs or capacity development. We now have to say capacity development. I'm still not entirely sure what the difference is, but capacity development programs, and we're all very much involved in those with the schools of internet governance that have been established that many of us participate in, as well as Diplo Foundation and various other types of activities. And then the other one was dialogue forums, places like the IGF or others that contribute to discussion. All of these can be thought of in a way as social formations that feed into and bring life into those different vertically structured institutions, pump new people into them, pump new ideas into them, cross-cut them and tie them together through policy networks and distributed networks of expertise, people who are involved in different spaces, et cetera. So they are an important part of the ecosystem and one that's often overlooked, and academia fits in that context. And the question is exactly how we want to define that relationship. And it's something that we've all struggled with, because the incentive structures for academics are so different from what they are for people who want to be involved in policy. If you are somebody who runs around going to ICANN and IGF meetings like me, you could have scholar colleagues saying, what are you doing going to that when you should be at the American Political Science Association presenting a paper that will be published in a journal read by 130 people and peer-reviewed, and that will be what, helps you move your career forward. And you say, yes, but I'm trying to actually be part of the real-world discussions and contribute to concrete real-world outcomes. And they think, but that's not developing the scholarly field. So there's always this problem for academics of how much to engage in applied research, how much to engage in policy dialogue without endangering their status in academia. And I think that's something everybody struggles with. And I think the kind of folks who come to IGF tend to be the people who have chosen to be a little bit suicidal and do that. But for a lot of other folks, they don't want to. And that's an inhibiting factor. I think also, by the way, to me, and I'd be curious about your thoughts about this, I think disciplinarity is an inhibiting factor. For me, I came from a political science background, and then I taught in departments of communication. And political science, the way it was institutionalized historically, established focal points around a bounded, structured conception of the field. You had, I'm from the States, so you had a field that was divided into, political theory, American politics, comparative politics, which is national level politics in different countries, and international politics. Those four, everything fits into those four boxes. And scholars that I know would say to me, well, you're doing this policy kind of work and you're not framing it in terms of the literature. For them, what you have to do is you have to write stuff that says, as so-and-so says, parentheses, year, date, etc. And it's all about building off the literature to show your bona fides and position yourself in a discourse. If you're engaging in a broader policy kind of discussion, then you don't fit in very well. So the incentives of disciplinarity, the fact that you're supposed to behave and write in a particular way, inhibit people's ability, I think, also to contribute. This may be less so for lawyers. For political scientists, for social scientists, I think it's a problem. So that's something that I think that is worth contemplating. Communication is a very differently institutionalized field and a very fragmented one with many, many different kind of focal points and not as much of a coherent intellectual body of thought that one has to cite and position oneself in. Other fields are different. But so the question then is, how do we build internet governance studies as a space when we've got those incentives towards disciplinary fragmentation? And how do we engage effectively between doing scholarly work that builds a space, internet governance studies, and also being applied and relevant? But does anybody want to build on that a little bit, or should I go to the audience and see if others have thoughts? Yeah, sure, Maria, go.
Well, I think that first of all we have, and you have heard me talk about that earlier, we have an additional difficulty with internet governance, which is the fact of how the stakeholders have been organized and laid out in terms of participation. The academics have been conflated with the technical community. And over the years, we have grown with the understanding that the academics that conflate with the technical communities are the ones from hard sciences. And the ones from political sciences had no space to participate. And many times we participate as civil society. So most of the committees and commissions I have been part in my life, I have participated as civil society representative. And I think it makes our work a little bit harder because the logic through which the two groups work are different. Civil society has the goal to convey, well, broadly, simple ideas that will make people conflate around and convey simple messages, while academics need to question concepts and ideas as we have been discussing here. So it's not the same logic. And when I stop to write, I recognize that I have a lot of difficulty because sometimes I'm not sure if what I'm putting on paper is something that has been internalized as the ecosystem, for instance. Sometimes it's really hard for you to think critically about these concepts and ideas when you participate on a day-to-day basis as civil society. I think that another thing is that for some areas you can write about them without leaving the area, but for new areas like internet governance, it's really hard to do it. And the few attempts of academics that I have read that do not participate in the field and are starting to write about it because now everyone wants to talk about internet governance, they convey interesting ideas, but it's trying to kind of forcefully make the field fit into something that it's not supposed to. And just to quote an example, I know that we have called internet governance a regime since the beginning because of the definition. But I mean, if you go to the traditional definition of regime, it would not really fit there because, you know, regimes are, for a start, are government-led. They are started by governments. Of course, they're organized with other actors, but the logic is different. So traditional regime theory does not apply very well, but we do apply it. And the few academics that have started to publish about internet governance recently, they are calling it a regime of regimes because it's regimes gathered together, and it's a very not helpful way of understanding the field, but of course they are using established theory to do it, so probably they will be the ones that will be read because it's really hard for you to coin new terms to explain when you don't have that in your sleeves. But you can only coin new terms when you really participate and you understand why regime theory does not apply very easily here, and you understand the actors and so on. So I think it's a fake trade-off for us. We need to be in the field in order to be relevant, in order to understand what really we are writing about, but we have to be careful because of these reasons that I mentioned before. We have to, and that is why I think it's so important to have spaces like this in which we can talk between academics and develop understanding about concepts. And we were talking before the session, you mentioned concepts, and I think this is a very interesting issue. Like in Net Mundial outcome document, distributed governance models have been elevated to the level of principles. So it's a principle that underpins the internet governance regime. But if you go to regime theory, you know that when you call something a principle, it has consequences. Because, you know, principles are something that if you change a principle, which is the very base of the regime changes itself. So we are kind of very much ossifying the idea of distributed networks here. Maybe it's a good thing. I'm not making a judgment, not passing a judgment, but are we really aware that we're doing that, or we just find the idea of distributed governance beautiful and we started to call it a principle? But I mean, it has important theoretical implications and practical implications in the future, like you said. So yeah, these are the difficulties that we have.
Let me try a different angle. And this, coming back to what we were just talking about, I said I thought the term ecosystem was a little problematic. Everybody nodded. Okay. So, fine. Why is it problematic? I mean, this term has become deeply entrenched now as a meta-framing for everything we're doing. How do we view, I have my own views about this, but I'd like to hear from others first. What do you see as being the pluses or minuses of the fact that people in decision-making positions, people with resources, people who control institutions, have now glommed onto this idea that we should think about this entire environment as an ecosystem? What are the consequences of that? Jeanette, what do you think?
First, it makes me smile because I remember, not sure you remember, but we once had that discussion on a panel in Berlin where we were also asked to talk about this, and Urs liked it, and I really dislike the term. I don't use it. I can hear that everybody seems to like it because it really sort of has diffused throughout the internet governance world within, I would say, a few months. And I've always been wondering why people like this term. I'm now going to explain why I really dislike it. First of all, the system part, I think, is just wrong, because what we usually engage with are people, strategies, intentions, and the whole notion is that we want to be the ones who shape that space. Whereas ecosystem, I connote with completely different forces. Forces like selection, where sort of plants and animals interact in a way where change surely takes place, but not in an intentional way driven by what the entities in that system they on a daily basis do. So I think the term ecosystem actually fails to emphasize the driving forces in the internet governance space.
It's an interdisciplinary area, and therefore, for example, at the Institute, we have also courses on internet governance. And one of my colleagues here, Bedi, who is responsible of that courses, taking into consideration this fact, there is an interdisciplinary area ahead of us. Therefore, it's not fully legal, not fully technical, not fully political, but consists all of kind of different areas, branches. Therefore, within our master program, IT Law Master Program, we try to combine together technical people, legal people, IT lawyers, and also related governmental officers, also civil society representatives. We try to combine almost all of the related stakeholders together, and in order to share their opinion and their point of views and approach with us. Otherwise, it's really difficult to build up a courses or create an environment on internet governance issues. We have to work, and we have to work very closely with other stakeholders in order to create something.
Lilia, what do you think? Ecosystem? Does that capture the nature of the environment we're in?
Part of the group that she was hearing opinions. I don't have the opinion.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Urs? I'll give you mine in a second. Urs? Well, I hear you're an advocate.
I think that's not entirely true. I don't feel that strongly about it. My support, or why I use the term, first of all, there is no obvious alternative that I find more convincing. And second, there is an element that I like about it, and at the same time, I share also your concerns, but since you articulated them so eloquently, let me focus on what I like about it. I like about it because the connotation of the term suggests a certain degree of complexity. It suggests a certain degree of interdependence among the different elements, which may be living elements, but also non-living technical elements. And it suggests some sort of a flow perspective as we look at this space, or whatever the alternative term would be. And these are some of the qualities that I find particularly helpful as some sort of a mental model we build. So for instance, well, no, don't want to go into that, but we all know metaphors matter, right? Whether we think of the internet as a series of pipes or something more dynamic, obviously that's very important. And so that part of what it connotates, or what I at least connotate, that I like, yeah.
Okay. I'll just give my view, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I think it's an ideological strategy. The term, if you actually look at how it got introduced into the literature or into the discussion, it largely came from the technical community. It came from Vint and various other people writing over and over and over, describing the I-STAR institutions as comprising an ecosystem. In fact, if you look on the ICANN website, they have this lovely, extraordinary graphic that shows how the multi-stakeholder ecosystem works, where bottom-up people all collaborate together in dialogue, and the decisions are made that satisfy everyone, and then these are then ratified and become policy. And the groups that they show as being involved in this are all the I-STAR institutions, and then WC3, IETF, and the IGF. Now, I don't think that captures the entire internet governance environment. There's a lot of internet governance decision-making that goes on in the governmental sphere and in the intergovernmental sphere, which is not part of that particular institutional matrix, number one, which is kind of blocked out by that. Moreover, I think that the term implies a certain stability and harmony, right? I mean, it's sort of, when you talk about when people think about an ecosystem, unless they're talking about Koreani-Skatsi, ecosystem out of balance with nature, right? Because an ecosystem is living organisms interacting with each other and their material environment. If you buy into that framing and the way it gets discussed all the time, you get the impression that all of these relationships are very stable, working efficiently, there's happy feedback mechanisms, the system is all self-correcting, everything's wonderful. And to me, that seems to really deny human agency, as you indicated. To me, the world of internet governance is a political space. It's a space in which power and politics and divided interests and other things get played out. And so there's some downsides to it. But the upsides, I will agree with you, Urs, it emphasizes both the intra-organizational and the inter-organizational connectedness, and it emphasizes also those trans-institutional enabling connective tissues I talked about before, whether it's the policy networks, expert communities, and so on and so forth. So it gives you a holistic vision, in a way, of the space, and having interrelated component parts. But it just sounds, to me, a little static and too happy. But that's just my own view. I'd be very curious from other people's views. Okay, so we've now tossed around a number of ideas. I see a gentleman in the back who's been waving at me and is urgently desirous of speaking. So I will maintain a speaking order, and we start with the gentleman in the back with the mic, then we go to the woman here, and then Carlos. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself when you...
Andrei Sherbovich, National Research University Higher School of Economics, Moscow. I'd like to share a bit experience of what we're talking about. Firstly, when we begin an idea of researching and studying internet governance and teaching internet governance in our university, we faced some problems of that is multidimensional, and the course could be designed. For example, for lawyers, it seems like the legal subject. For political scientists, it seems the political subject. For economists, it seems like economic subject, and something like that. But we created, our experience is to create interdisciplinary research group from different faculties, which is based on participation in the Internet Governance Forum. And now we are on the way even to the master's program on Internet Governance in our university. So the basic approach is multi-subject approach to cooperate between people who are dealing with different areas of fields of study. It's just an experience of learning in governance. Maybe someone could also have another ideas how to deal, especially for those who are not experts in this for the students. But it's always interesting for newcomers, for students who want to deal this research in the sphere of Internet governance. The last word. Firstly, when I speaking about the Internet governance with the non-prepared auditorium, I always facing with the question from the auditorium: how it's possible to govern the internet? It's not possible. Internet is free. It's not possible for any kind of governance. But I designed the course, and it's named "Realization of the Constitutional Rights and Freedoms on the Internet." Thank you very much.
Before you sit down, can I just ask you, I'm very curious, can I ask him a question? Give him back the mic, please. In Russia, when people talk about governance, does the idea, one of the central concepts of the internet governance literature and a lot of recent scholarship on governance in the West has been that governance is not necessarily equated with government, but can be done by non-state actors and so on and so forth. Does that same approach resonate in Russian scholarship, or is there more of a presumption that the state plays a more important role?
About the literature, firstly, I used, of course, there's a kind of strange term, because and a lot of strange terms for Russian people. Even they didn't want to know. They didn't know what about the multi-stakeholderism, what it is. So, firstly, I recommend them the book by Jovan Kurbalia. This is the first for students, and introduction to the internet governance. And also doing the researches, but not only by scientific books, but by organizing the workshops, by watching the forum, by organizing the hubs, and they are studying on a live regime. They are asking questions in remote participation in the forum. So I think next stage is to send some students to the forum to participate. That would be good. Very nice.
Yes, you should bring them bring your students to the forum. I think that's a good idea. Thank you. The mic goes to the woman down here. And did you have your hand up also, sir? Okay, there was somebody else first, and then I'll come back to you. And I think do we have a question from the remote participants? Okay, let me take this woman first, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Camelia. I'm from Indonesia. I'm a student for communication studies in University in Indonesia, and also working for university in a small province in Sumatra Island. So it's kind of like really exciting for me to see all of you here to hear your presentation. Thank you. And yeah, it's such a privilege for me from a small province in Indonesia. So I would like to share also my new experience. This is my second participation on IGF, and me and my colleagues, we just published research about internet governance in Indonesia, but relates to LGBT and feminist and queer studies, because it's we start this research because there's LGBT sites are being blocked in Indonesia. So how we trying to find some ways and roads, what's happening about internet governance in Indonesia. Is it there, or how is the involvement of multi-stakeholder, etc. And I'm so interested with what you're saying about involving more young people to research about internet governance. I kind of like really agree about that, because I feel they are the generation, I think, for internet era. But for GigaNet and the network of the researchers of internet governance, I would like to know more about where and how is the young people network researchers for internet governance? How have you been planning about a network and support for them? Because my experience when I tried to write and finish this research, I kind of like really looking people like you who, for example, who wants to be like to discuss and share and something like that. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Carlos, and then the remote. Okay, we'll take the remote question first. We'll take the remote question first, and then Carlos.
Okay, we have a question from Egypt. His name is Amr El Sadr.
His name is?
Amr El Sadr.
Okay.
Question to the panelists. I'm curious if there are any existing theoretical frameworks or concepts you, in your roles as researchers and academics, find particularly useful when approaching internet governance and the complexities of multi-stakeholder involvement. If the answer is yes, examples will be appreciated.
Just understand that I'm reading the transcript, it says, are there frameworks or concepts? Is that the question? Are there frameworks or concepts?
Concepts.
Yes, okay. Frameworks and concepts. All right, Carlos? We'll take all the questions, and then we'll come back as a group and go through, see which ones people want to respond to.
Thank you. Carlos Gutierrez, Internet Society Chapter, Costa Rica. I was going to stand still because there are no economists in the panel, but then Ellie Noam walked in. So that gives me the inspiration to ask about economics of governance. My idea of governance is to whom do you go if something goes wrong, particularly in economic terms. And my question to the panel is, if somebody is doing some what-if analysis, what if the governance model does not work well? And from my perspective, not working well in terms of economics could be a series of scenarios that the productivity increases in the developing countries aren't as great, or that competition is not enhanced, and we will get the antitrust busters soon into the governance discussion, or that the new GTLDs will create walled gardens and protected areas that aren't as open as the internet. Is somebody doing research on that? And if the research is positive and says that, well, internet governance is perfect, is taking care of economic welfare, everything is solved, what other social problems can be solved with these multi-stakeholder bottom-up governance models? Thank you.
Carlos, I'm not sure you have to be an economist to answer those questions, but we can certainly bring Ellie into the conversation. There was a gentleman back here who had his hand up, and then I'll come to you, and then back to you, and then back to you. Okay, let's the gentleman back here behind the.
Hello, Bedi Kaya, assistant professor of law and lecturing on internet governance, and I'm also ISOC ambassador to the IGF. It will be more likely a comment, not a question, with regard to the, comment provided by my Russian colleague. I think the issue is that when the same understanding is also applied to Turkey, when in lecture I asked the question, who governs the internet? The answer is that US governs the internet through ICANN. So this conception, the misconception between governance and government is also valid for Turkey as well. But the issue is that why we do need governance, I think is really important. The answer is quite straightforward. If we don't have governance, we will have government, and at the end of the day there will be fragmentation of internet, and it will not be internet at all at the end of the day. So there is a really need to distinguish this and raise awareness accordingly with regard to the difference between government and governance. Thank you so much.
And again, your name was?
Bedi Kaya.
Okay, thank you. Walid?
It's Walid Al-Sakaf. I'm currently a lecturer at Örebro University in Sweden in media and communications. I find myself coming back full circle here in Istanbul because I first started my whole academic career at Orta Doğu Teknik Üniversitesi. Türkçe çok iyi biliyorum. And I recall very vividly how the internet infrastructure in the early 90s, it's nostalgic dial-up days, was developing in Turkey. Over the years, I've seen the tremendous impact of the internet, I must say. And though I am in Sweden, I come from Yemen, so I can see the bridge in Turkey as one of the leading countries. However, in the academic aspect of it, do you see that the liberty of academics and researchers in doing research on sensitive topics on the internet, such as censorship, is it an obstacle, or do you find it that it's much more like liberal to pursue that? Because I personally finished my PhD in website censorship circumvention, and luckily I was in Sweden, otherwise I would have not been here if I were to do it in Yemen. So you can see that I'd love to know whether Turkey has advanced and progressed enough to reach that level. Thank you.
Well, Walid, I can't speak to the Turkish situation, but maybe the colleague will when we come back. David? Oh, and then the woman here.
Sorry, no, just a pretty simple question.
Say who you are.
David Cake, actually probably speaking as a student from Curtin University here. I just wanted a question about the disciplinarity of internet governance, which is, say, clearly law and international relations scholarship is very heavily represented both on the panel and generally, and a few other disciplines sort of get a bit of a look in here. There's a sprinkling of sociologists and economists. So which disciplines do you think are not sort of present in enough, and would we really benefit from having more of involved, and not just independently, but in terms of interdisciplinarity, who would be really helpful to, get pick some methodological tips from, or so on.
Great, thank you. And then finally the woman here, and then we'll come back to the panel and see if they have some thoughts in response.
I am from India, and I am working with a grassroots organization called Digital Empowerment Foundation.
What is your name?
Ritu Srivastava, and there are many research topics which have been on internet governance is also covered by grassroots organizations. They are doing a number of research on their own primary research areas. What is your concept? What is your idea to integrate all those research areas as well? Research, for example, we have done a research on access in India. What is the access of a wireless spectrum in India? So, what do you think when you integrate such kind of a research in some global international level of forums? So, what is your take on that?
Just so I understand exactly, you want to know about the status of research on access at the global level?
Yeah, exactly, and when there are a number of researches happening in developing countries in their own nations, how will you integrate such kind of a research into the global platform like GigaNet?
Oh, I see, okay. All right. Thank you very much. We have a number of very interesting questions on the table here. We had started with the Russian colleague talking about the difficulties of getting scholars and students to understand the nature of internet governance, given the interdisciplinarity of it and so on, and pulling together programs. We had Camelia, I think, from Indonesia, talking about sites being blocked and asked about what young people, about work for, support for young people involved in the field and whether anything is planned, intended in that manner. Amir asked about frameworks, analytical frameworks, if there are some overarching analytical frameworks that particularly animate internet governance work. Carlos wanted to know about market failures and other kinds of examples where internet governance may fail and whether people are doing interesting work on what happens when governance fails. Turkish colleague, Belid, I think, said, well, he basically was saying that it's very important to do governance, talk about governance, or we'll have governments, and how people perceive the U.S. dominance of ICANN as being internet governance. While he raised the question of doing sensitive research, particularly in non-democratic settings, I suppose, and is that an obstacle to the development of the field? David asked about disciplinarity and what disciplines are not represented as much as international relations scholarship and so on. And then finally, our colleague from India asked about work about local access issues in developing countries, how that's being addressed. So a number of interesting points. Perhaps we could just go down the table and see which ones you guys want to pick up on. And I might, maybe I will also, I'll give you a second to think about that. And Ellie, I will put you on the spot since we have a leading economist, a longtime scholar of telecommunications and internet who just wandered in here unprepared, and Carlos directed a question towards him. Would you be interested in responding to Carlos's inquiry? He thought you might have some ideas. Do you want to think about it? You think about it. Okay, fine. So then we'll start with Urs. We'll just come down to the table.
Okay, so that's a long list of questions. I'd like to start just quickly with a response to our colleague from Indonesia. So as far as this network of centers approach is concerned, we're taking an institutional approach, which actually ties back to the question of operating in hostile environments. So to work with institutions, research centers, as opposed to individual researchers, has a number of advantages, including that you have some protection by the institution, especially when doing sensitive research. That being said, we also invite young people to our events. We typically have a young scholars forum, and I'm sure Jeanette can talk more about that. We have that within our network, but also associated to individual centers such as the Berlin Center, also the Berkman Center. So we're very much open and welcoming to young scholars. We also have exchange programs and affiliates from around the world. So I'm happy to chat offline more. On the question about integration, to go back to India, sorry, I didn't get your name, about integrating research that you've done, for instance, on access. We're currently building at the Berkman Center a platform called Internet Monitor, and the hope is that this platform actually is offering an interoperable platform to all researchers who want to share data with the global community, acknowledging that we have a data problem, that much of the data in internet research is actually owned by private entities, by corporations, and not easily accessible and available to the public. And so our hope very much is that we can work together with a global community to populate this platform. We have already quite some data sets in there looking at access, control, and activity on the internet. So I encourage you to check it out. The website is internetmonitor.org, but you can also Google Internet Monitor and Berkeley. I could respond to the others, but...
Maria?
Okay, I'll try to connect a few of them. The first is a question about young people and how to involve them. From what I've seen, at least in international relations programs, the interest to develop research in this area has grown exponentially. But mostly are people that are starting to do research in the field. So one thing that we can do, other than have initiatives such as this one to welcome and embrace them and involve them in the community, is connects to the second question related, the armor made related to frameworks and concepts, which is to try not to impose pre-established frameworks because it's easier to do so. What I have learned when I started the PhD, I was writing a paper about internet governance, and I thought what was going to, to please my advisors, what was something that I could use to communicate. That's why I reached on the regime theory, because it's how we define here internet governance regime. And after I finished my presentation, what they told me is that this is not going to help you. I'm sorry, but throw regime theory away and interdependence, because it won't apply to the field. So you have to go to other areas connecting to what Dave has asked. So I'm in international relations, but what they're telling me is go to sociology, try to develop an ethnographic study, because many of these organizations that you're talking about, I mean, we have a very broad idea, but we have no clue how they work. It would be really interesting to go to the field and to document how these organizations work. And even when we are dealing with internet governance, I think that there's a lot that we hear about. I mean, unfortunately, I've never been to an ETF meeting. It's something that it's on my agenda, on my to-do list, but I know from people that have been there, but it's really important to be there and to understand how it works. So I think there's a lot to be done, and these other disciplines, sometimes they just bring a different air and way to understand the field. Sometimes just applying the concepts and the knowledge of where you are located won't help you, and this can help us move forward. I think that's it, yeah.
Okay.
I just want to say something about academic freedom. There is there's freedom in the academic world or not.
You're addressing Walid's question, right?
Sorry?
You're addressing Walid's question?
Exactly. I can say yes, just because I'm from Istanbul Bilgi University, and I attended IGF, and as the same university, we organize with another colleague of mine at Bilgi University. They organized Internet Ungovernance Forum at the Istanbul Bilgi University. There is the freedom. Just because they don't believe or they argue there is no internet governance in Turkey, we have kind of problems we have to discuss. But except this building at the Bilgi University campus, there is the freedom. We are working at the same university, and they criticize the applications or the situations in Turkey. They can write academic papers or books on censorship or internet restrictions, etc. I can also criticize the government, but I prefer to work with them and show them the right way which they follow, and I like to show them the solutions, and I try to change something at the government end, at the parliament, in terms of regulations, etc. That's the freedom I believe we have. And in regarding your question, allowing participation of young people to our activities or research activities on internet governance or multi-stakeholder internet governance. I want to request my students here in this room, particularly Bedi and the youngest colleague of him, they can say something about this. Please.
Where's the mic? Just to say, it is now 4 o'clock, so we should wrap up in about 5 minutes, but
Okay.
go ahead, please.
Very quickly, Leila was my teacher during undergraduate, and now I'm working together with her, and Ramazan now is my assistant, so we are following the path, and the age, average in our university, in our team is low. We are trying to be as dynamic as we can, and there are opportunities in that regard. So I would like to thank Leila for being so open to us. And I think that we shouldn't lose the connection with the youth, because they know better than us. They use the technology indeed better than us. And even just a very quick example, in an undergraduate course, I asked the students what the internet changed within their life. They didn't provide any meaningful answer because they were already born within the internet, but they provided some kind of different answers to social media, which shows that the comprehension of youth of internet will be substantially different than how we understand it. So we should always have a link, a connection with the young people, young researchers, and try to have their insight with regard to the interpretation of law, governance, and the academia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jeanette, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd like to address the question of are there any frameworks or concepts. As Urs mentioned in the beginning of this panel, we had at the GigaNet meeting on day 0 in the morning a session that specifically addressed the question of theory in internet governance. And me and a colleague, we gave a paper where we said that in our opinion, the field of internet governance research is seriously under-theorized. There is no clear notion of what governance is. We use the terms regulation and governance interchangeably without ever clearly distinguishing between them. So I think there is a lot of work to do that probably needs to come from the outside of internet governance. There is broad literature on regime theory, on institutions, on institution theory, regulation and governance, and that needs to be brought into this field. We also problematize the fact that we are very unclear about the scope of governance. Because we have such a broad understanding of governance, it's almost impossible to say what is not internet governance. So we should really spend some time and try to define our research unit a bit better than we have so far. We made a practical proposal on how to do that. The paper is on SSRN if anybody's interested.
Okay, is that it? All right, then I will pick up the last 2 questions that were not addressed. David's question about what disciplines are not present enough.
Sorry.
Okay, well then you can say something too.
Okay, in my mind, I think what is really lacking in this field, particularly in the studies of specific organizations such as IGF, ITF or ICANN, is organization studies. There is a huge literature on organizations, their evolution, their internal dynamics, their interrelationships, etc. And my feeling is we do not make enough use of this kind of literature. It's really smart and helpful. That's one field. Then Maria mentioned ethnographic studies. There is one now on the IGF, which is actually quite amusing to read, but it would be good to get more ethnographers watching us and participate in this field so that we can benefit from their kind of knowledge. What also is not well developed is the sociology of internet studies. Most of them focus rather on how people interface with new technologies, but there is certainly more to do in terms of transnational communities evolving and what that actually means. So these are 3 examples.
Mm-hmm. I would say that, in my view, is that the field tends to be most heavily populated by legal scholars, political scientists, people from communication studies, and perhaps fourthly by economists. You could, it depends on how we're configuring the field, but IG studies per se, I don't see as many economists here. There are lots of economists doing telecom, street telecom, and telecom regulation at the national level, but not stuff on international institutions and how cooperation emerges and the kind of collective frameworks of action that have been institutionalized in different aspects of the internet governance field. I see less economists doing that kind of work than the other national level and so on. I would add that we could use more social psychologists because people who work in internet governance are truly mad, and there's so many forms of interesting behavior that emerge in internet governance spaces that actually drive impact outcomes in ways that often are not appreciated. I think all of the fields that work, sociology, anthropology, and so on, that work in a sort of more constructivist kind of orientation have something to say that hasn't been said enough myself. Lastly, on Carlos's point, I don't want you to think we forgot you. I think the study, there's no presumption in the study of internet governance of success. And in fact, I think certainly as a political scientist, people who study international collective action don't start from the assumption that it works at all. Very often it breaks down. Very often cooperation is not achieved. Very often institutions fail. There's market failure, if you would, rampant throughout the system. And so there are consequences to that, and we can go through those consequences in different issue areas. But clearly there are people who do think about that. Yes, very much so. And I think that this is an area that obviously perhaps more could be done. Just to conclude, because I know it's time for everybody to go, I just want to point out to you that we have a panel. Why we do this at the IGF? We have a panel here with Switzerland, Brazil, Turkey, Germany, the United States represented, and we had questions from Russia, Indonesia, Egypt, Costa Rica, Turkey, Yemen, Australia, and India. So this is why we're doing this in the IGF. It's a unique environment, and it's a very good place to have these kinds of dialogues. So I really appreciate Leila organizing this panel and inviting me to moderate. I hope you all found it interesting, and I thank you for participating.
Söylesene hanımefendinin